Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and this is going to be the last installment in the Pearl Theory series. Up to this point, we've done a lot to try to understand the implications of the different areas of the map, we've taken a look at how the map wants to be played, and now we get to take all of those and create compositional requirements from them, then building style cohesive rosters from the conclusions that we find. That said, it's going to be a long haul, so let's get right into it. Before getting too deep into things, we first want to take a quick look at where we've come from and give me the window to recommend to all of you that if you haven't watched the earlier episodes to go do so. This is going to be a lot more valuable if you have that foundation already set. Prior to now, the steps that we've taken are first developing map abstractions, which are areas of comparison that we can use to qualify the map. Then we took those map abstractions and converted them to macro strategic principles. Which sides should we prioritize, how should we prefer hitting on attack, etc. Now in this step, we're going to be converting those macro strategic principles to generalized utility that we're going to need as a team approaching this map on both sides. And what that will allow us to do is then take specific agent use cases, map it over those generalized utility examples, and then mesh those all together to create compositions. And while I say mesh them all together like it's going to be some simple last step, what in reality is going to happen is we'll take a look at triangular style dynamics and really a broader macro-strategic theory of the game, and use those to create best fit compositions that are all style aligned. So, to kick off creating these generalized utility examples, we're going to go back to our macro-strategic principles from the most recent episode. They were an attacking priority of full Bs, A splits, B splits, and full As in that order, and a defensive priority of strong siding B rather than A. Starting with attack, the first thing that we have to be able to solve is getting that B hit to full strength. The easiest first step in all of these attacking processes is going to be to just lay out where we expect defenders to be. And while obviously there's not going to be a dozen defenders on this site, what it will do is by thinking through this process comprehensively, it will insulate us against even the worst case scenarios. Once you have these down on the page, you can dissect them into what are really staged groupings in the order that you'll contact them, and in this particular instance, you can really even isolate out just those front two-most elements as your first port of call, overlaying the defensive lines of sight that these defenders are all going to have, and it becomes apparent why those positions are the most pressing. When looking at defensive LOS denial in a vacuum, the first response is always going to be, oh, just flash it, because that's just the most bountiful utility that you're going to have access to serve that function. But in this particular case, there are so many swingable instances of cover that the likelihood defenders are simply going to counterswing on your flash makes it not a realistic solution. Even if we start looking at landscape shifting utility like Viper Walls here, all of the best use cases still don't really deal with these frontmost positions unless you're just going to go for gross inefficiency. So with both flashes and Viper Walls out of the running, we're really only left with informational tools and smokes. The first option that we come to here is going to be a close smoke, and as attackers this gives us a fairly easy crossover, but what it also does is give the defenders something that they can lurk up into, and it's ultimately really not denying those frontmost positions, it's just giving us cover from them. And while that in and of itself basically crosses this option off the list, what we can still consider is a dissipate. This is also a really good place to pause and just explain that going forward throughout this video, one of the diagrammatic tools that I use is I will invert the coloration of certain abilities when they are optional or being used in an alternative function. So if we looked at the full smoke for Astra here, it is bordered in the color of the agent and filled with white. However, when I invert those colors, it's indicating a dissipate, since in terms of the actual ability graphics, they're the same thing. In other instances throughout this, we'll have, say, an inverted color KO knife, and that will represent something that's optional on default and doesn't represent a strictly necessary piece of util. But back to the topic at hand, what this dissipate does is all of the things that we were just talking about with the close smoke, but without the luxury of time if we're going to cross, and in return we're not supplying the defenders with that lurkable opportunity. And while this dissipate is going to get us a lot of incremental value, it should get us to that midpoint of B long, it's still not getting us to sight and isn't insulating us against any of the sight side holds. To hit that second stretch, we're going to use a piece of EBP here. For those of you who don't know that term, EBP is simply entry by proxy, basically drone abilities. And so the use of a Fade Prowler or a Sky Trailblazer here will absolutely pay dividends. You can use the Dissipate to give it initial cover, ensuring that it will get most of the way up long, if not all the way up long. And I very intentionally left out Owl Drones and Boombots here, despite the fact that they're alternative elements of EBP, because Owl Drone's distance that it can cover simply will not get the job done here at all, and a Raise Boombot with its lack of pilot ability just isn't going to be consistent for this use case. We should have really thorough control of long at this point, but it's still not going to get us across that last leg so that we can physically get onto site. And so for that, we'll use a sight side smoke just along that apex of the first corner. This suffers from a lot of the same issues we were just discussing with the close smoke. You've got that person on the close corner that might be able to lurk into it, but where we've got EBP that should be making its way most of the way, if not all the way up long, this is going to be one of those hard clears for that utility. Now looking at this, a lot of teams, when they tackle this map, are probably just going to completely forgo the first half of this equation. They're not going to have that Dissipate. They'll probably just full force dry EBP, and the issue you're going to run into with that is those two forwardmost positions that were the thing that we wanted to tackle most immediately. Those are just going to deny those drones regularly, and you're going to be put in a position of util inefficiency where either you have to burn another piece of EBP, or you're just flat up denied depending on the amount of redundancy that you have in your comp. It's because of that if you're not going to run the Astra here, you don't have access to the Dissipate, you're going to have to proxy something of sort of equivalent facilitation to make sure that your EBP is getting as far as you need it to. It's probably just going to be a flash around the corner in most cases. Trudging along though, at this point, we should have more or less static control of B-Long. We've smoked it out, we've used info tools to take control in an insulated way, and so how the heck do we get from here to the site itself? Even potentially before we round this first corner, you're going to be running into 4 defensive lines, one of which may or may not have been soft cleared by the info tools. And so from a min-max perspective, what we want to do is look at how we can make it so that we're simultaneously fighting as few of these angles as possible. This brings us back to that Viper wall from earlier, and this is where it pays most of its value off. If you have this and somehow don't even have a sight side smoke, it's still going to isolate you down to only 2 fights as you come through, 1 additional, but it would force a swing through a Viper wall. And even beyond that, if you continue pushing onto site, it does a great job of isolating fights into very clustered packs where you're never taking more than 3 duels realistically. For those of you familiar with some of my past theory, angle density is a term that I use for the number of angles that you are swinging into when you enter a new space. And so one of the things that I tend to optimize towards is AD3, an angle density of 3, as really the upper bound of what you want to consider realistically feasible for your entry players. But let's say you don't have the Viper wall here. You're almost 100% going to have that site-side corner smoke, and you're going to be flashing through onto site. But because that's the only smoke that you have, and you're working with limited LOS denial, your AD is going to be way higher. The number of angles that you swing into is going to be at least double. And so you're going to want to use another piece of catalytic util, like a recon, to get additional value there and sort of inform you what of those angles are going to be most pressing, and you'll probably want to use a supplemental smoke as well. So the way I have it hypothetically mapped out is that corner smoke, a heaven smoke, a flash, and a haunt through. And even in that situation, depending on whether or not your EBP as you came up long cleared that close right corner coming from long, you're swinging into AD 5 or worse. And that makes us want to consider more options. This is where something like Neon is going to come in, because Fastlane allows you to segment the site in a favorable way. Dare I say it? Even Phoenix has a decent value prop here. At the end of the day, a slice is a slice, and taking your AD 5 down to an AD 2 or 3 is something you should always want to do. So let's do what we actually came here to do. Let's take all the things that I just discussed in terms of how I expect we'll be able to realistically scale to the site and convert it into generalized util. We are going to need EBP, first and foremost, and ideally it's EBP that's covered by either a half smoke or a flash to make sure it gets the distance that we need it to get. You might be able to proxy this with a recon, but I honestly wouldn't recommend it. You're probably going to be faced with an ultimatum of getting recon information on those front 2 positions we discussed, or getting info on more site-side stuff, and that's just not a trade-off you're going to want to make. Then you're going to need a smoke for the top of long, and for site itself, you're going to need a smoke, you're going to have a pretty heavy preference for a slice, and then you're going to need catalytic util, most commonly a flash plus a recon, but you might get creative with something like a breach stun or a neon stun. But that's not all we need to consider. You also have to actually look at post plant, and for that we want to take 3 distinct scenarios. There's the push through towards defender spawn, there's the on-site post, and then there's the off-site post. For the push through, you'll obviously need catalytic util. More often than not, you're just going to yeet a flash through, and that'll be the thing that lets you push. For the on-site post, you're going to need a resmoke more often than not, you'll need counter flash, and you'll probably want additional catalytic util on top of that, something like a recon to re-clear B-link so you know you're not getting pinched. And I want to make the clarification here, because I know this term gets mixed up by people all the time. Counter flash and anti-flash are not the same thing. Anti-flash is when you have someone on your team who is tucked so that they don't get flashed, and then they swing off of the cue of your opponent flashing you. Counter flash is when your opponent flashes and you flash them back. So I want to make that distinction. The last thing to look at is the offsite post. This will usually be for a corner plant, and the biggest thing you care about here is defuse denial. You gotta molly the hell out of it. If we combine those to create a more holistic view from scaling through exec and through post, what you end up with is this. 2+ smokes with a high preference for a slice, the plus in that 2+ being the re-smoke in post. For catalytic util, I have it written as 1++, because for you to get away with only one piece, you're basically 100% going to need that slice. You're going to need either a neon fast lane, a phoenix wall, a viper wall, something to segment things favorably, because otherwise you're not going to be able to contend with a sufficient number of defender lines with a single piece. Like, a one flash is not going to get there. The additional plus is, again, we're assuming that we probably want more of this for post. We need that EBP with preferred redundancy. This is to get us up B long. The reason I say redundancy is preferred is because, let's be real, it's always preferred. If your drone gets shot out, the likelihood that you want a second one is going to be pretty high. And then, of course, we have the defuse denial, which only really pertains to this if you are going to aim for those offsite post plants. Let's shift it over to B-Link, and it's going to be the same process. We drop in all of our defenders, but then when we get to our process of trying to stage and segment them out, there really is no scaling to it. As soon as you round the corner, it's 84. And could technically even be 85 if you expect, like, a judge immediately through the bottleneck. What little segmentation we can do is going to follow these 3 groupings. And working with these groups, the thing that immediately stands out is, let's just slam a large smoke in the middle of it all. That large smoke instantly isolates that frontmost judge spot. I expect most teams are going to EBP through this corridor, so I don't think it'll be a super common play, but I know it will happen, so I'm just including it. The second grouping is going to be towards connector, and you're dealing with a similar situation to what we ran into with both of the smokes on B long, where this is super lurkable by those connector players. And then things get a little bit dicey because on the far side of our smoke, we're still swinging into 83, and it's 83 where every single position has jiggleable cover. One of them is a soft wall, but even so. Now, what you could do here is throw that smoke, clear the close person, scale into your smoke, and then EBP out and just say, all right, we're going to contend with the connector players if they decide to just dry push our smoke. And that will get the job done, to be completely fair. It'll be a little bit sketchy, but it will definitely get there. An alternative option, though, is the Viper Wall that we like, which takes this and instead of segmenting it into 3 groups, now carves it into 4. And what this allows us to do is repurpose our EBP. Instead of pushing it through our smoke to help contend with the 83 on the far side, we get to just send it up connector to deal with any potential lurk-throughs. And because we've used this wall to isolate the 2 positions that are far towards site, we can just dry push through our smoke and opt into a duel with the single position that's still within that corridor. But we're trying to be fairly all-encompassing here, so what happens if we don't have a Viper Wall, and we don't have large smokes? The simple answer, and by simple I mean only real answer, is a smoke around halfway through the corridor. You could smoke connector here, but if someone pushes through it, you're just absolutely destroyed, so I would highly recommend against that. And so assuming we go with this partition smoke in the middle, you get to follow a fairly similar scaling pattern to what we have with the large smoke. You EBP out, and you're dedicating that to clearing the close corner, and using it to push back any lurkers or holds in connector. You then use that space to scale up to your smoke, and this is where things get a little bit sketchy because you are going to take a dry duel with a potential lurker who is in that smoke. And once you're in that smoke, you still have to get through to the other side safely, and you're swinging into 82. The way I have it diagrammed is you intentionally pushing through the south side of that smoke, because at least in some senses, it will give you a better swing. You may reduce it to 81, and if it is 82, one of those players is only going to have soft wall coverage if they try to tuck. But because of that ability to tuck, if you're going to try to create an advantage duel here on that swing, a single flash isn't going to do it. The ability to play anti-flash here is way too easy. So instead of singular flashes, we start looking at large zone catalytic util, things like neon stuns, paranoias. Here you can technically even consider zone denial in a more traditional sense with something like a raised paint shell. The last leg here is to get onto site itself, but as per our macro strategic tenets from the last video, we're not going to be doing dedicated B-link hits. This is always going to be married to a split. And so we're relying on the pressure from B-long to create opportunities for us to get out. This isn't something where you're going to be burning a ton of util as the B-link half of this exec. So to summarize the util that we need for B-link, and reminder, this is just for B-link. If you're going to do it as part of a B-split, you still need all of the same things that we listed for the full B. It's going to be a strong preference for a Viper wall. I think that quad segmentation as opposed to triple segmentation makes a really strong case for it here. You'll need a smoke with a preference for a large one. If you're going with a small smoke, you will need large area catalytic util, and you will need EBP with redundancy preferred, as always. Alright, on to full A's. Now that we've done it a couple times, we should be able to blitz through this a bit quicker. Here are all the primary defender positions, but where we're looking at it from barriers, the thing that we're most concerned with are the most forward lines and the ones that are going to be scaling towards us. These positions are going to be fairly constricting in and of themselves, but what's made even worse is if you have someone who's scaling along the far outside line of A main. This is the play pattern that will get defenders to the position we talked about in the last video, where they've effectively doubled the amount of work required from attackers to now take this space. Fortunately, assuming that we're exerting enough pressure on default, we should be able to interrupt this scaling before it gets to that point. The three positions that we're mostly concerned with are these. The self-revealing way of tackling this is something similar to what we've seen a couple places now, which is a dissipate towards the crux of long and a flash through the other side. This will deal with two of those primary positions, but the third most that's more towards sight technically has a tuckable position where they could be playing anti-flash. What we'll want to do here is provide ourselves with a little bit of soft insulation by using an info tool. This could be a recon, it could be a KO knife, but what its ultimate goal is to try to tell us whether or not people are scaling forwards or there's someone more passively staying in that back position. If the info tool gets a couple pings and indicates that there are people scaling forwards, we'll flash as we originally diagrammed, and we should be able to take duels with those individuals without exposing ourselves to the third deep position. And if the info tool doesn't ping anybody, and we're assuming that if there's anyone holding this, they're going to be on that deep line, we want to make sure we have an attacker scaling to the far east side of long and pushing with our flash. They want to transition from that east edge to the north edge, and by getting close up on that, they're now in an advantageous position to push back that rearmost defender. The other option here, if we're not running an Astra, we don't have access to that dissipate, is to use a full smoke on the far side of long. This creates a bit of an isolation for us, and we're going to use our info tool in a super similar way where we've thrown our knife, we know if they're scaling aggressively towards us. In this situation, though, we get to use our flash optionally. If they're not scaling towards us, we don't even have to use this flash now. We know that we can sort of take control of the area that's been corralled by our smoke and do so safely if our info tool doesn't get pinged. Assuming that we've gotten all of this A main control, though, what happens when we now have to go into site itself? As has been the case a couple of times, a simple flash through while it deals with some of the immediate lines is going to be pretty easily dodgeable by a number of positions that can play anti-flash. And so as we've done, we want to segment things out again. The white here is going to be our first grouping, the red our second, the blue our third, and the green our fourth. Something that we do want to keep in mind as well is that while we have segmented out those first and second groups, if there's a piece of passive info util towards the front of the site here, they can queue off of that and make it all one massive singular front wave. All else being equal, though, the first thing that we want to think about when looking at the segmentation is center site smokes. We want to carve out those back positions from the front ones. Once we've isolated those front foremost positions, we can use a piece of EBP to hard clear all of them pretty efficiently. Unlike at B long, we can also consider an AL drone here. Depending on your team's willingness to take dry fights, it may be as simple as we have information on their positions with these prowlers, so we're just going to double swing them. Could be that you stun someone with a sky dog, but generally you'll probably want some degree of supplemental util here, a flash for front sight, the ability to sage wall off A-link, something to that effect. These center site smokes are a little bit weird though. I know that at least from what I have seen, they aren't particularly the standard. I think that if we go back to our map abstractions from the first video in this series, if you want to compare this to bind, those make the most sense, by a fairly significant margin at that. That said, I know that there are going to be a lot of teams that have a preference for deeper smokes towards the back of the site, and so let's take a look at what those accomplish. As opposed to fully isolating only the four frontmost positions, what these smokes will do instead is isolate those front four plus one additional pivot position in back sight. Coming out of our smoke in A main, we've functionally increased our AD from 3 to 5. Because of this, defenders are going to be able to demand more util from you. You're probably burning the same front-end EBP, and more or less the exec is going to look the same even following that. You're probably going to look to isolate out a link if at all possible. You're going to use a front sight flash, but then you're also going to be using either a backsite recon or a backsite flash to then take those positions. And while I definitely alluded this to being negative with the angle density increase coming out A main, there's definitely benefits to executing this way. It's not going to be a situation where one is uniformly better than the other. Particularly, what this does is it gives you a much more potent on-site post. You can position in such a way that you have a really strong pivot position that's then locked in at the center side obstruction. You have coverage of both defender spawn push-through points. All in all, it's a pretty comprehensive way of playing post that if you've been playing predominantly off-site prior to this would be a great mix-up and sort of encourages you to execute in this way despite the increased risk when you're initially taking the site. But I digress, let's summarize this all. To take A main, you're going to need a smoke that can be proxied with a dissipate, you'll need a flash, and you'll more often than not require an info tool if you want to insulate yourself against counter aggression. Looking at site, you'll need 2+ smokes with a slice preferred so that you can isolate a link. The plus, as has been the case numerous times, is predominantly looking at resmokes and post-plant. You'll need a piece of piloted EBP. This is a really important distinction. I say piloted because the diversity of angles that you are looking to clear here isn't going to be something that is going to be consistently achievable with, for instance, a boom bot. An important side note is that this can be proxied with covered dive and a recon. If you have a jet that cloudbursts front sight, dashes into it, and there's a recon overhead, that will do the same job as piloted EBP will in most cases. And last, you have the catalytic util, which will be that front sight flash that we diagrammed, the optional recon if you want to be pushing back sight, and then there is also the option of backside zone denial if you want to do something like an Astra stun to really just make their life miserable. That is absolutely on the table. Looking at post plant similarly to how we did at B, you've got a couple of options. You have the A main offsite where you're going to need defuse denial, you've got the defender spawn push through where you'll need catalytic util, and then you've got the onsite. Here you'll need a resmoke, if not multiple, counter flash, catalytic util. This is mostly going to be recons for A-link and connector rotational information, as well as insulating yourself against the deep flank, and then you'll also want some zone denial or stall. Unlike at B, here we have two ways from defenders spawn into sight. Because of that, we want to be able to disincentivize both being pushed at the same time. Whether that be a Sage Slow, a Molly of some variety, a KO nade, any of these will work. We're just trying to isolate the number of flood rotational paths that the defenders have access to. And the last thing worth noting here, which we didn't mention in the last one just because the tightness of the bottleneck makes it a little bit less appealing, which is a late lurk. This is going to be a rewrap. It will have variable to no util and is something that I just wanted to tack on here. Rolling that all up into one, you're actually going to have pretty high ranges of util. If we're using a dissipate when we're taking A main, for example, that's going to grossly change our smoke budget. If we're executing for backsite control or not backsite control, that's going to change our catalytic util budget. But the way it all hashes out is 2 or more smokes with a slicer wall optional depending on whether or not you want to deny the A-link lines, 2 or more pieces of catalytic util, which can include a quote-unquote mandatory recon if you're going for that backside exec, a piece of EBP with redundancy preferred. This is a bit of a weird one with like 10 different asterisks on it because you can proxy it with covered dive, as we mentioned. It needs to be pilotable if you're going to use it because of that front sight angle diversity we discussed. And depending on whether or not you're using the mid sight or the back sight smokes, that redundancy goes from preferred to like nearly mandatory. Regardless though, the last one's a lot easier. It's the defuse denial with the normal caveat of whether or not you're doing the offsite post. Last but definitely not least, we have a link. We can toss in the defenders, their LOSs, and we can even segment them super easily into 3 groupings. The most common way of breaking through this space is going to be to use a piece of, you guessed it, EBP. But when looking at the way we route it, there are a couple of vision breakpoints that we need to consider. The first breakpoint is just around the first corner where you enter the vision of 2 potential defender positions. Once you get here, you should be able to reveal one of those positions, but the box inside of art can be tucked behind, making it unable to fully hard clear the space. The second breakpoint is at that second corner in art where you begin to be exposed to the deep LOS from news that double stack in A-Link. The third and final breakpoint is as you're leaving art and become exposed to a connector. Because of where all these lines of sight fall, if we don't make it halfway between the second and third breakpoints, we can't fully clear the box inside of art. And so we need to start asking ourselves, alright, how do I create a situation where I'm going to consistently be able to clear art itself so that I'm at least taking incremental space even if my EBP gets denied? The most util efficient way of achieving that is just to use a dissipate. We don't need a massive amount of cover here, we just need long enough to get us to that halfway point. Allocating a star here also isn't the worst because in the event that we round that first corner, that first breakpoint, and we catch someone on the shallow line from barrier towards the front of art, we can turn that star into a suck and firmly corral them into art in a way where we can kill them. They're either a chamber that we've forced the TP out of, or they're dead because there's a dog or a prowler running headlong at them and we've swung them and at their back is a suck. Once we've taken that first segment of art that's associated with the EBP, the next thing that we have to contend with is those leftward angles towards a con. The easy band-aid solution for these is to Sage Wall it or Cyber Cage it. You just create an LOS obstruction and you pass it, understanding the fact that there's a good probability that there will be late rotators coming through it. Some teams will throw a standard smoke here, which I don't agree with. I think you're just creating a window for lurk opportunities against you, which is why I strictly highlight the Sage Wall that they will have to shoot through or the Cyber Cage that will give us info of them. Then you have fixes that are a lot less passive and we're just going to get past you and a little bit more confrontational. You have large zone catalytic utility like breach stuns or omen paranoias that actually line up pretty damn perfectly with the way that you have to scale through Link. This will get us towards sight and that third stage, and as was the case with B, we're not going to go into detail of this third stage because the assumption is that this is a split and those are being preoccupied by our A main players. To summarize our last attacking corridor, we need one or more piece of piloted EBP. Redundancy here can technically be proxied with those large zone catalytic util elements I discussed. And in addition, you're going to have a strong preference for a smoke, a wall, a dissipate, something to increase the efficiency and the reliability of that EBP, as well as insulate you a little bit better against the A-con players that you're going to have to pass. Now we get to the roll-up that really matters. This is power scoring the highest value of util from any category in these execs. We need 3 to 4 smokes or LOS obstructors with a very strong preference for slices at numerous locations. We need 2 to 4 pieces of EBP with 3 or more strongly preferred and at least 1 being piloted. We need 2 to 4 pieces of catalytic util with at least 1 recon, and we're in a situation where we would prefer defuse denial if for no other reason than variation and flexibility. At this point, you're probably checking the video length and making sure I'm not about to ramble for the next 25 minutes about defense. Fortunately for us both, defense is handled a completely different way. On attack, you have a finite number of ways into sites, and the only ways you can win is by killing all the defenders or planting the spike. That makes things super linear. On defense, things are a lot more abstract. You can divide it up into a number of different archetypes. First, there's the option to hard hold a site. This is basically to fight it to the death. You can have entrenchment setups, which are based off of util traps and really putting yourself in as much an advantage as possible. And then there's also skirmish hard holds, which are going to be fighting, flashing, and then literally just putting your gun on the opponents. As opposed to hard holding, you can instead play for retake. And even within retaking, there's two primary options. You can play to flood, which is, as it would imply, flooding the site, fighting immediately, and trying to catch timings, disrupting your opponent in the middle of their execute. Or you can be playing for a set retake, which is more like a re-exec and a big util dump. As is the case with basically any retake, you're going to have the options to flank or not flank within both of those. Since there are all these options though, we now have to make a decision. None of these are objectively better or worse than the others, at least not until you start looking at your compositions. This is when we have to start talking about style alignment, and opting into playing the game a very specific way. You see, on attack, no matter whether you're playing an aggressive comp, a controlling comp, or a mid-range comp, you're still trying to plant the spike. You're still going to have to scale through space in fairly predictable util linear ways. But on defense, I have choices. Based off of my composition, based off of the preferences of my players, we can choose to play very specific ways. Do I have explosive playmakers that we've put into an aggro comp? Well, then I'm probably going to play skirmish, hard holds, flood retakes, and counter aggros most of the time. Compare that to a team that knows they have phenomenal anchors, wants to play control, hard hold, entrenchment constantly, and it's literally different planets. Neither is exclusively superior to the other, it is a stylistic decision. And that's why we have to bring back style dynamics. For those of you who don't know about style dynamics, highly recommend you go back and watch my Mastering Macro video on it. This is a triangular balancing system that has appeared in TCGs, other MMOs, so many competitive avenues that you can hardly count them. The fundamental premise being that there are three major archetypes of play. Aggro, which is focused on tempo and pace, control, which is focused on permission, and mid-range, which is focused on flexibility. The reason it's triangular is because aggro beats control, control beats mid-range, and mid-range beats aggro. Personally, I use a quantitative system that grades all of the agents within Valorant to this triangle. Not only that, but I use it to then grade stylistically inclined compositions, and in the entirety of 2021's professional play, I had statistical evidence that these dynamics, the aggro beating control, the control beating midrange, and the midrange beating aggro, held up at a professional level. So now we have the understanding that we have a very specific budget of utility that we need to make a sound attack, but what we want to do on defense isn't necessarily going to be dictated by a difference in util budget, it's going to be dictated by a difference in style that we want to explore. To display what I mean, I'm just going to show the three stylistically optimized comps I believe work best for this map for each category. For aggro, we have Astra, Chamber, Fade, KO, Neon. For control, we have Omen, Cypher, Fade, Viper, Chamber. And for midrange, we have Astra, Viper, Fade, Sky, Raze. We can look at each of these independently to understand a little bit more what I mean about their stylistic inclinations on defense. Starting with our aggro option, I imagine this would be a really strong core element to a defensive playbook. We have Astra playing a really deep line covering A main, and that's reinforced by Neon, who's playing a pivot position between A main and Art. Fade is playing a float position between Art and B Link to allow her to be where she needs to be to trade EBP whenever our opponents make a presence. And then towards B itself, we have Chamber and KO playing a fairly aggressive setup where Chamber takes a grossly forward line and KO is mostly there for support. Otherwise, he's looking to support B Link if that's pressured. You might look at this and say, when we did our macro guidelines, didn't we say that we were supposed to strong side B and this has more of a bias towards A? And you would absolutely be right, but there's a huge caveat to that that's band-aided by this comp's aggro nature. Because we have Neon, an aggressive agent with incredibly fast rotations, we can afford to play an A bias and still be, in more ways than not, strong side B because of the accelerated rotation she has access to. The only thing that really matters is that we have forward information if something is going to happen B. That's why Chamber is so far forward, that's why we have a trademark so far forward in B-Link. The idea is that if they do end up pressuring B, we can be strong side there before anything of significance goes down. All in all, it's a defensive setup that stays within our macro strategic tenets while creating a favorable situation for the team that's based in the stylistic alignment of the comp. If we look at our control comp, it's a completely different look. We have Chamber in the same position as he was in the last one. We have Astra in a 2-phase hold on B. We have Fade in a 2-positional hold in B-Link. We have Viper playing a float between B-Link and Art. And we have Cypher playing the pivot between A-Link and A-Main with a full retake setup on A-Site. Now let's think about this. The hallmark attribute of a control composition is that it is permission focused. You're only allowed to go where this comp wants to allow you to go. By allocating a supported chamber to be long, that is more or less locked out unless you are willing to dump a ton of utility there. Even when you dump a ton of utility there, the relative proximity of Fade and Viper makes it so that there can be a more or less 4-stack on this site by the time you're actually hitting it. If you want to go to B-Link, super similar situation. We're postured in a way where we have an info tool there that will inform us of any move you try to make, and then it's very quickly collapsed on by 2 people. If you want to go through Art, we have 3 layers of Util segmentation with the Viper wall that's all heavily disincentivizing. You can choose to put the Cypher camera there as well if you don't need it for retake, and that just gives you more passive information there. And A, the one place that we are giving the attackers permission to enter, we are already set up to retake. We have preset cyber cages that allow us to scale the way that we need to, getting out from defender spawn, as well as taking up positions in A-Link. And if we use our retake camera, we get prime information of some of the on-site defensive positions. And this is just control embodied. We are saying, you can't enter here, here, or here. You can enter here, but we're set up to beat you if you do. And you'll look at some of this and say, okay, this looks super inefficient. We're not doing anything really with our Viper wall. And you'd be completely right. One of the other core attributes of control, at least in its defensive use cases in Valorant, is how important conditioning is. This is only one setup in a broader playbook. The idea is that we're keeping as much of our conditioning util constant as possible. We'll have a passive info tool in A main and B link consistently, we'll be throwing this Viper wall and the Poison Cloud consistently, and that will create a situation where, regardless of what signals we're showing our opponent in the early round, they don't know what is behind those elements. It might be this setup where we're playing to give up A. Alternatively, it could be a setup where we've put Chamber with his Rendezvous and a Judge between our segmentations and Art. Good luck figuring it out. You're gonna have to burn utility to do it. Creating a situation where our opponents are forced to respect our utility at all of its points is what drives the permissive nature of control. And finally, we have our mid-range comp, which you'll notice very quickly has almost nothing laid out. And that's because, well, it's mid-range. Mid-range, when it's not counter-aggressing, aims to play reactively more than anything else. As much as it's focused on flexibility, one of the other hallmarks of mid-range is efficiency. It will look to outvalue you. You can look at this default and say, okay, it's well spread, and the way that the agents are positioned makes it so that regardless of where our opponents decide to burn their util, we're prepared to counter it in a way that is almost sure to beat them on efficiency or win out on sheer volume via attrition. You really want to take B-Link? Well, the way that we're laid out, we can deny it with Prowler trades, then a Boombot trade, then a Skydog trade, then we can seize you, we can stall you with an Astra Stuck, we can nade to zone deny you, we can counter flash you multiple times. Take your pick and good luck. The comp is structured in such a way that it will force you to use util more than once pretty much anywhere you want to take space, and in doing so, it will weaken your execute enough that it should be able to hold. And while it has the natural B bias that our macro tenants defined, the way that it's set up A has adjusted the Viper wall so that we have an easy inflow from defender spawn. Further, it's set up so that we can retain A link control. The sketchiest thing about running a comp like this will always be the absence of passive information. You're not going to be able to rely on a trip to tell you that a flank is coming. You're not going to be able to use it to defend a bottleneck. You're going to have to rely on running your mid-range comp correctly and cycling all of the active information tools you have, of which you have absolute mountains. You have Sky Flashes, Raise Boom Bot, Prowlers, Haunts. The amount of active info options that you have access to, including ones that are on refreshing cooldowns, is ridiculous. Closing the loop on these comps, obviously you would still have to map out a ton of defensive playbook and all of the attacking playbook, but the things that we've covered in this video lay out pretty formulaic ways of attacking each site, or at least understanding the dynamics that you're going to have to deal with when you're hitting them. And so now we're just at the question of what style do you think suits you best, suits the current meta balance state of the game the best, and which one do you want to chase? Creativity will be the backbone of taking any of these comps further than what I've shown here. Speaking of creativity though, before we go, there's one last comp I want to tease everyone with. I dare the bravest of you to take a whack at building a playbook for this. This is a shout out to all of the one and done comps, a cringe comp completely focused on novelty. Omen, Viper, Fade, Breach, Yoru. So that is quite literally all I've got. If I were to go any further, it would be me building out the entire playbooks for these comps, which, while I'm sure many of you would enjoy, is super anti-competitive of me to do and self-defeating, so it's not going to happen, I'm sorry. But I'm really hopeful that this sort of gave you all insight into the process that I use when looking at a brand new map, from trying to compare it to other maps, to translating that all into a way to look at it at a macro strategic level, and then even applying style dynamics and a really concise sort of distilled way of looking at how to hit sites and defend sites that allows me to build compositions that I can then develop playbooks for. Super interested in everyone's thoughts, feelings, suggestions, critiques, as this is probably as comprehensive a video as I'll ever put out on this topic. But that's enough of me dragging it out. If you made it to the end of this behemoth, a massive shout out to you. If you're not subscribed, I hope I've earned it here, and you've gotten more value out of this than you didn't. Also wanted to give a quick shout out to my YouTube members, Hick Messiah, Golden Fury, and Colin Torbis. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.